Good afternoon, all, and welcome to this webinar, The Trends and Drivers of the Contingent Workforce. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll focus on the growing impact of contingent working as an essential part of a workforce management strategy, exploring what's involved and how to make the most of it. We expect there to be lots of questions, so please send them via the Q&A button you'll see on your pad there on the button below. We'll leave 20 minutes or so at the end to address these, and we'll get to as many as possible. Whilst you're logging on, I'll give you a few introductions. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Giant Group, a leading contingent workforce management company for the last 30 years. The areas we're going to cover include contingent workforce trends, the current state of the recruitment market, the four main focus areas of a contingent workforce strategy, where to start when looking at contingent workforce planning, how to build a contractor value proposition, look at the supply chain risks and compliance, and then conclude with the questions and answers. Our keynote speakers today are firstly, Christine Morton. Christine is a principal consultant at Proxima. She's a procurement leader with over 20 years experience helping organizations manage the different ways talent can be acquired to match overall workforce planning goals. Her career has spanned procurement, category management, contract management, with a specialism in HR and contingent labour. Christine works for procurement consultancy Proxima, part of the world-renowned consultancy Bain & Co. From Giant, we have Dan Haslam. Dan is Group Sales Director, and his role includes helping clients to manage their contingent workforces compliantly and cost-effectively using the whole range of Giant's services and products. Dan is also a member of the board at the FCA, the UK's leading membership body for umbrella companies, limited company accountants, and CIS payroll providers. I'm David Hopkins, a workforce management consultant here with Giant, and I'll be the chair for today. The format's going to be that Christine and Dan will answer a number of set questions, which will put them in order to give us a full view from a hirer and a provider perspective. There will be an opportunity, as I said, for me to put your questions at the end, so submit them via the Q&A button, which you can hopefully see on the toolbar as we go through this formal session. So hopefully you're all now settled in. Let's begin with a look at contingent workforce trends and the current state of the recruitment market. Christine, good afternoon. Why is contingent working becoming more important, and why does it need to be considered?
Good afternoon and hello, everyone. Contingent workers, and by that I mean people paid by time, but not on an organization's payroll. They make up about 25% of an organization's overall workforce. Some research companies put that figure much higher when they include more of the extended workforce, such as those working on statements of work. But with such sheer numbers, companies can't afford to ignore this sizable workforce. And as a workforce, it needs to be treated as such. There are significant macroeconomic trends that are making contingent working an attractive option for both companies and workers.
Okay, so can you please elaborate then on these trends and tell us how the market looks right now?
Sure. Well, let's start with four trends that are impacting on contingent labor. The first one is skill shortages. Skill shortages are continuing. 80% of employers are reporting talent shortages per manpower. A recent report from Josh Bersin said that time to hire, which is usually an indicator of how hard it is to recruit, is increasing. And even at a recent parliamentary event, Royal Mail said time to hire is at 67 days. NHS professionals themselves also said that they have an 8% vacancy rate. It doesn't help that demographically that there's actually fewer people around to do the work. And yes, that's even post-Brexit, where immigration is higher. Net immigration last year was over 600,000. So there's also even a significant amount of people who are on long-term sick in the UK. And that's causing challenges as far as how many people are available to do work. The second trend that I'm seeing is wage inflation. So the average permanent salary increase has been around 5%, but inflation, depending on your sources, is running between 8 and 10%. Reed's most recent report has reported that the average salary across every sector has risen. The third area is that there's questions about whether there's a pending recession. And so when there's economic uncertainty about, companies have a commitment phobia when it comes to permanent hiring. And so they revert to contingent labor in times of uncertainty. Fourth area is that there's an increase of people looking for jobs. So there's been an increase in the number of people, the first increase in the number of people looking for jobs in 25 months. I think this reflects the cost of living crisis, where people are looking to gain higher wages to counter the impact of inflation. The boss of Reed said recently said that it's no longer a candidate-led job market. I'm not sure he's correct, because once you add the demographic pressures and the continued reports of skill shortages, I would still class it as a candidate-led job market. I predict that you'll be seeing more use of contingent labor, and you'll need to pay more for it. It's a classic demand and supply curve. You'll need to make sure that your organization is at the forefront for talent attraction, recruitment, and retention.
Okay, so what about the options within the contingent labor sector itself then?
Sure. From within the contingent sector, I'm seeing that the use of managed service providers, the MSPs, and vendor management systems, VMSs, they're very well established. People have been using them for years now, but there's been slow adoption for changing these programs, slow adoption on adding statement of work to these for a variety of reasons. And the off-payroll working rules, commonly referred to as IR35, are well known, despite some still trying to work around the rules with varying degrees of success. I would say that total talent management, where consideration is given to the workforce as a whole, is still a holy grail for many companies. What total talent management is it looks at the use of permanent, contingent, statement of work, and other areas that make up the whole workforce to determine the optimal state for a planned workforce. But companies are still struggling with workforce planning, which often means that contingent labor spend increases on a reactive and not proactive basis.
Christine, I just want to jump in there one sec just on that, because I think both you and I know there's plenty of models out there in the market where people are trying to manage their contractor workforce, and even on a total workforce management perspective, but there's still loads of areas where there's no coverage. So whilst these sort of schemes are in place, these programs are in place, there still seems to be pockets of workers here and there where there's a lack of visibility. Have you got any thoughts as to where those come up in terms of, the reasons why businesses can't get their arms fully around that full population?
It's a real challenge for companies. I think, if you don't have strong processes, it's not uncommon. I mean, I've sat as a procurement manager within many companies, and you'll have someone within the business run to you, say, I need the supplier setting up immediately. I've already signed a contract. What? And you are then backpedaling to try to get those, make your stakeholders in the business quite happy, get whoever needs onboarding. But it means that you are now potentially going outside your overall program, your processes that you've all got set up completely. So it depends on how strong your processes are and what you have to do in those situations where people are looking everywhere for talent. I get the sense that the skill shortage challenge is really pushing people to do what they can to find and attract people.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Get the person first, and then we'll sort of figure it out from there. It tends to be the feedback.
I still see it happening, even when you do have an MSP, and then you are backtracking to try to figure out what you need to do.
Yeah.
Dan, good afternoon. Yeah. Hi.
Okay.
So what other things are you seeing then from a candidate perspective in all of this? What do they face when they're looking to be engaged?
Well, I definitely agree with all the observations that Christine's made in terms of the demand aspect. Businesses are definitely looking to be as agile as possible, and all the stats back that up. There's a growing mix of workers working in businesses that are operating on a contingent basis. But I think that also reflects the way that there's absolutely an appetite out there for people to want to work in that way as well. So it is a demand supply from both sides, both from the candidate perspective as well as from a business perspective. Obviously, we've all been through the COVID period, which has made a big shift in the way that workforces operate, that whole sort of working from home culture that we all, or many of us now, work as a mix of that and in the office. I think that's definitely accelerated the appeal of flexible working for lots of different people. I think demographically, you've got some interesting trends happening at both ends of the age spectrum. So you've got younger people that are coming into the market, perhaps that have done a spate of traveling and now looking at getting into the world of work, who are actually, especially in the STEM sort of sectors, actually quite happy to take contractor type roles and continue that journey traveling around. It's remarkable, really, post COVID, how many examples I've seen of people that now work remotely, whether it's, like I said, a young person continuing that traveling journey, or people that are further through the career that are then looking at working from holiday homes. So we certainly saw a load of contractors that we managed popping up in Biarritz and loads of different places, sort of post-COVID, where they decided to work remotely. And that sort of shift just aligns itself a lot to people wanting to work in a contractor type role. It's obviously a requirement for a lot of people now looking at flexible working hours, so the opportunity for them to look at taking short-term gigs from multiple different places, often looking at working for multiple hirers at the same time, is definitely a growing trend at different areas in the market. And I don't think that there's the same sort of stigma attached to people sort of career changing. So again, it's rare now that people work for the same employer for a long period, and it makes the candidate far more likely to consider working on a contracting basis. So there's definitely demand out there for that. But again, there's still, whilst there's demand, there's also supply is short. And as Christine's touched on it, and I'm sure we'll talk about later, multiple ways that businesses need to be thinking about talent attraction to try and bring the right people in. In particular areas, skills are still very, very short, and I'm seeing trends such as businesses looking further afield now to try and hire people for roles. Just really trying to make sure they've got access to as many different types of candidates and talent pools available to them as possible. Whether it's easier or quicker to find a contractor role at the moment, I'm not sure. I think we went through a huge spike in obviously roles being available last year, and that's tightened up somewhat, although we do see in our numbers that growing trend of the contractor work starting to pick up. So I still think it's the case that there is work out there, and people are prepared to work on a flexible basis to either achieve their lifestyle goals or the financial goals.
Yeah. So if employers are then looking at different ways of hiring people and looking more at the contingent market, then what are you seeing in terms of the services they need to manage that? What's changing there?
I think it just depends on the challenge that business is trying to overcome. So for some, and for a lot of businesses, it's very much that talent attraction challenge. We can't get the skills into our business that we require. And so in that respect, in terms of approaches, then businesses are just looking at trying to have as many different ways that they can attract talent into their own business, whether that's having an internal talent attraction team that will work within the business. On top of that, engaging with recruitment suppliers to support on niche roles, or if there's mass onboarding required for projects. I've also seen businesses looking at engaging with software providers that provide recruitment services on like a platform perspective. So rather than your traditional recruitment agency, there's actually offerings out there now that people can hire and attract talent and manage it using software, which is interesting. So you've got a chunk of businesses that are looking at trying to solve the TA challenge, and therefore looking at putting a process in place that can accommodate all those multiple ways of bringing people into the business. But then you've also got hirers that might be looking at it and saying, okay, we've got talent attraction, we've got a handle on that, but what we're struggling with is the proper management or payrolling and compliance support required to actually manage these workers. Is expensive. Are they looking at trying to reduce costs? It really just depends on the issues that people are trying to solve. We touched on it a little bit earlier in Christine's section around control. 99% of the time when we talk to a client about how many contractors do they have in their business, they'll say, well, I think it's X, but I'm not entirely sure, and no one really has a solid handle on that. And obviously, if you've not got control over how people are entering into that workforce, then that leads to rising costs. You need to look at managing that. I think the other thing as well, when people are looking at how to manage workers and looking at how to sort of create a model around that, is just making sure that they've got the ability to engage contractors in a variety of different ways. So we touched on IR35, and we'll come back round to it at the end of the session. There's obviously that's change has driven lots of different engagement types for contractors. They might want to still operate through limited companies, which they can do if the process is followed. They may need to be employed. We've had lots of businesses post IR35 take on contractors on a sort of payroll perspective, and then decided sort of 6 to 9 months later, oh, ouch, actually contractor payroll is a little bit trickier than permanent payroll, and we might need to look at managing that in a slightly different way. I think another big one at the moment that I'm seeing at all levels in the supply chain is also trying to address funding pressures and cash flow pressures within supply chains. So it's not unusual for hirers to look at pushing down credit terms of 30, 60 days. I've even seen examples of 90 and 120 days out there, which are in a sort of low interest rate environment would be quite benign. But now interest rates aren't low and they're increasing it. That's causing quite a bit of pressure in the supply chain, and people looking at trying to tweak their models to be able to ensure that suppliers can engage and provide workers, and workers get paid on time rather than having to necessarily delay payment to workers. Because if you start to do that, then clearly that has a knock-on impact on talent attraction and the ability to try and attract people into work in the first place. But I think generally speaking, there's a bit of a gap in that market of businesses that have contractor populations, anything from 10 to maybe 100 contractors that fluctuates. There's often no formal managed service put in place to sort of try and manage that. So it's lots of different payrolls, different hiring regimes, different recruitment supplies involved, and it all gets a little bit Wild West, shall I say. So I think there's a potential opportunity there for businesses to actually look at using some suppliers to come in there and put a wrap around that to bring some control to it, reduce the risk and reduce costs.
Yeah, and just to jump in there, you touched on, Dan, the issue of people wanting to work anywhere, and I, from a risk perspective, be very, very careful of, do they have, if they go to another country, for example, do they have the right to work in that country? Are you payrolling them in accordance to, so we're in the UK, we have national insurance, we have all those kinds of, employer on costs, but different countries have different schemes. And are you, you could even get different employment rights, around that. So be very careful. I think the biggest risk that I've seen is if people have the ability to sign contracts, and that could be in your sales teams, it could be in your C-suite, it could be in procurement, you could run the risk of opening what they call as a permanent establishment from a tax perspective. And that means that, not only would you, yes, you have to deal with all the equivalent of PAYE stuff in the country that you're working with, but you have to be really careful about corporation tax, that you could be liable for that. So just be very careful from your policies, your communications, and that you are checking where are these people logging in from, and are we all, as clean as we can be from a risk perspective.
That's a great shout. That's a great shout, Christine. I think, yeah, definitely. The international piece is growing out there. I think plenty of commentators are saying that. And actually, a lot of the models that are in place to manage those people internationally tend to be focused on a permanent basis, as in a permanent staff member getting paid a salary on a monthly basis. When it comes to then a contractor that might be paid on a day rate or an hourly rate, that becomes slightly out of kilter on that sort of model. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. We've seen the rise of the employer of record type arrangements over the last sort of 10 years to help people set up businesses, but it should, as you say, it should be a short-term solution really, because once you start to operate for a significant period of time, then you are running that establishment risk that you mentioned. So It's useful, but don't use that to manage contractors on a long-term basis, because you could end up tripping yourself up, quite right.
Yeah, exactly. And but then again, how many contingent workers have you seen that have been in post for years and years and years? You know, I think the word contingent becomes a bit overused, perhaps, you know, when some of the people have been in post for 10 years or more. It's easily done.
Yeah, agreed.
So despite some of these sort of new and slightly different problems that we're facing as contingent workers develop, as a concept, it's not going away, is it? And indeed, we're probably missing out as employers if we don't embrace it as part of a total strategy. So given what's involved then, Christine, do you believe that a strategy for contingent working should be included in a full workforce planning strategy?
Well, you know, I'm going to say yes to that on a very big scale. So I do believe contingent worker absolutely must be included in workforce planning. And I see the most forward-thinking companies are looking at the maturity of their contingent programs to improve them and considering where they want to incentivize real, you know, what do they want to incentivize relative to their permanent and other workforces. I think when they don't really think about those incentives, they may actually incentivize one type of population versus another. A story I frequently tell is I had a head of HR tell me, well, we're finding it really difficult to recruit this type of worker. So we've raised the pay to, it was 36,000 pounds a year at the time. And I said, that won't do any good at all. And he looked at me like I was crazy. I said, well, on the contingent side, these people are making 500 pounds a day. That equates to a salary of X. You know, it's 3 times what you're offering. And if things go wrong, they can leave with a 1-week notice. What would you do? And he hadn't considered the question of the impacts of what their I know we'll talk about it later, their contingent value proposition is versus their employee value proposition. So until you look at that holistically, you may be incentivizing perhaps the wrong things. So it's that total talent management question again. Do you want to have more contingent workers? Some companies do intentionally. You know, do you want to have less? What are your workforce goals? Do you want to have visibility, control? Is it all about cost savings or risk reduction? Like, these sorts of questions are really helpful in determining a way forward for what you want to do for your contingent workforce as part of your whole workforce. So when I get new clients, I always look at 4 areas when reviewing their contingent workforce programs. So the first one is procurement. So everybody wants to know about budgets. Do we have the right accurate charges? Do we have contracts that cover everything? You know, who's even writing the contracts? Is it already been pre-agreed? There's cost control, the terms, conditions, and even maverick spend when people go outside. So all that goes into the procurement bucket. The next area that I look at is HR. And that deals with headcounts and workforce planning. How many people do we have? How long have they been there? Long-term workers. Do you have 2-tier workforces where the pay is so out of kilter between one segment versus another? Are you seeing areas even on the permanent side that you're classing as difficult to recruit, but yet you can recruit them without a problem on contingent labor side? Even things like diversity and inclusion. I had one client where we looked at the diversity makeup of the contingent population relative to the permanent population. We found that the contingent population was actually younger and more diverse, which was in this particular client. And it was so interesting because it's shown a light on why can our permanent side not be able to recruit diversely when our agencies could. So it was very interesting. Also falls into the HR side is policy. Who creates the policy? How long can people be there? What roles can they cover? When can we move them from temp to perm and all that kind of stuff. The third area I look at is legal and risk. So the number one risk that I see often in contingent labor is tax, shortly followed by background screening. I've seen more fake background screens than I could that I care to remember, frankly, in areas that you really don't want them, doctors, teachers, it is very scary. And it's, not a week goes by that you see another story in the news of this kind of thing. The other area on risk I think about is health and safety, because often contingent workers don't get the same level of training that the permanent staff does. So actually you're more likely to get injured or worse as a contingent worker compared to your permanent population. Hopefully that's rare, but it still does happen. The last area that I look at is process. So how, from making the original request all the way to hiring, to timesheeting, to even offboarding, that's done and optimized. It's not uncommon for me to encounter a client, and I'll tell you a story. We had one client where it was a procurement team. They didn't want to involve HR or legal and risk or anything. We could put in a brand new program that's brilliant and easy to recruit for everybody. And what they failed to take account of is that they made it so easy that to recruit contingent workers, that if you were a hiring manager, you saw 3 weeks to get talent one way versus 3 months versus the permanent side. And if you're a hiring manager with, key delivery, at the forefront of your mind, what were you going to do? Of course, you were going to choose the quicker route, because that's what you're, challenged to do. And
isn't that also true, Christine, of the contingent workers themselves? I think speed and simplicity are, because they move around so often, they really don't want to get involved with something that's going to drag on and take time. Time is money to them, particularly. They're between contracts potentially. So
absolutely,
that whole it becomes a lot more acute perhaps than it does in a permanent environment.
Absolutely. So, if you are thinking about, how complicated it is to work through your application tracking system on the permanent side versus how quick it is maybe on the temp side, what's the right thing that you want to incentivize, and how can you eliminate bottlenecks so that you are doing the right thing for your company? So I look at procurement, HR, legal and risk, and then process, overall. If I look at any one area in isolation, I'm not going to get the best for my clients. So usually I rate each area on a red, amber, green scale, and then I find areas for improvements, because even things like if I can speed up the time to hire, that's a productivity gain, which, if you're a procurement person, we count that in our savings bucket as a productivity gain. We're making more effort to get people in post, which means that we can deliver more quicker, get their latest, greatest product to market sooner, etc. It's worth calling out that there's a helpful matrix from Staffing Industry Analysts. They publish a contingent workforce program maturity model, and it helps, it allows them, if you work through the maturity model, you can look all the way up to using contingent labor as a competitive differentiator when you're doing your workforce planning.
Christine, just a couple of things for me on that, actually. So I'm really interested on the matrix that you mentioned. I think often I come across businesses that operate with they feel the smaller number of freelancers, maybe 10, 20, 30, that sort of number. And they think, well, actually, is there a need to go into that level of detail? And I always say yes, because it doesn't matter whether you've got 1 or 1,000 different contractors, you're going to have the same challenges in terms of risk and control that you've mentioned. So I think that's a good shout. And I was just interested on your RAG analysis that you do. What are the common areas where you see more reds, and what are the common areas where you see more greens, or is it literally just a mixed bag?
It can be quite a mixed bag. Usually, I think HR teams really do struggle with workforce planning. So I have like a whole diagnostic questionnaire that I work through them, and I tell clients, look, it's okay if you don't know the answer to the question. It's really okay, because that actually tells me more about your program than you realize. Like, how many workers do you have? How long have they been there? What roles are they covering? Where is it difficult to recruit? All that sort of thing helps build a picture of where you are, and so then we can design something that's right for where you want to go with your program.
Yeah. So Dan, Christine summed up really very well there, the 4 areas and the things that the pressure points, if you like, and the things that hirers need to look at. What are you seeing in terms of demands from that market, in terms of the tools and support and other things they need to address the issues?
Yeah, I think that Christine's hit on the main topics there. There's usually three things that a hirer is trying to drive, right? They're trying to increase control, either because they've got none or they've got limited control on what's going on in this contractor piece, and they just want to try and get their arms around it to try and understand it. And then once they've got the control element, then from there they can look to hopefully manage down risk and potentially manage down costs. They'd be like the three main things that people are trying to achieve. So that's often the reason why people will look to try and put a sort of, you know, managed program in place to try and deliver that control, create a bit of a bottleneck, so that everyone that's coming into that funnel has to go through a process. That should then mean you've got visibility to who's operating within the business. And whilst bottlenecks don't sound like a good thing in general in terms of speed, you can still have a quick funnel, right? So you can still have people that can come in there and go through that process quickly. Pre-employment checking and screening is a classic there. It's typical that, you know, businesses can take months, if not longer, to bring people on board because they've got to go through detailed checks. They've got to go through referencing, again, depending on what sector people operate in, can depend upon what levels, you know, people need to cover. And I often find there's a bit of an acceptance that, yeah, that stuff just takes a while, so it is what it is. But actually, if good suppliers can get picking into that detail and find efficiencies to really speed up that process. So, for example, giant operator screening business, one area where we've looked at to try and slicken up the referencing process is actually trying to use open bank data so that you can visually see salary payments going in from an employer. So rather than waiting however long for HR to respond to say, yeah, Dan used to work for us and he was there between X and Y, you can do that like within an hour, basically just dipping into that data to be able to see the salary payments coming through, which shaves off a huge amount of time in that process. That's just one example. And to your point you raised, David, you know, the contractors, they want to be able to go through that funnel quickly. They want it to be a pleasant experience. They want it to be mobile first, ideally, because everyone's flying around, you know, on a phone. So if they can do all that good stuff on there, if they can do their onboarding information and accept the NDAs, the contracts, etc., they'll do it super quick. And we can onboard people rapidly, as other businesses can, if you just look at harnessing the technology, basically. So I think hirers are looking to gain control. The savvy ones are looking to try and do it in a way that doesn't detrimentally impact the candidate journey. These guys are heavily networked. They you know, speak to each other on a frequent basis. There's loads of different forums out there where contractors can share plenty of feedback around their experience. So it's all important to make sure that that's a nice, quick, slick approach, I would say. I think the other points to point out from a sort of demand from a hirer perspective, the holy grail Christine mentioned was talent pool. Was total workforce management. I think talent pools is another sort of holy grail that's often spoken about, but I don't see many businesses doing a good job of delivering it. Just because they tend to get focused on the here and now and the need to hire people today, rather than trying to think forward. How do we solve that to be more proactive rather than reactive? In fairness, the NHS gets a lot of bashing, but I see they've done some great work in helping businesses, also helping trusts to be able to share people from different trusts on a talent pool basis. So someone working in a certain geographical area can go and work in another. So I think that's super cool, and that's definitely what they've been forced to think about, to trying to address these talent shortages. And I don't think corporate businesses need to, you know, can't try and replicate the same thing. Try and cultivate a bit of a bench, a bit of a talent pool that you have. So when you need your freelancers and your contractors, you've got a population that you can use. You might even have them pre-employment checked and screened, so you can deploy them super quick. So if you look in hospitality sectors, for example, that's an area where, you know, if someone needs to turn up to host an event that needs to happen this evening, that's got to be a super quick process to get that person on site. So there's definitely agility and speed required when hirers are looking out to the market on solutions.
And using contingent workers, there's potentially more risks in there because it's a longer supply chain. There are more people involved. Are you finding employers looking for support in risk management and looking at that third-party involvement?
Yeah, I think, and again, we'll come back round to it at the back end of this session around the proposed consultation on payroll. But even outside of that, there's huge risks to hirers on supply chain and making sure that the right providers are operating in that supply chain. And often think there's an acceptance. If we've got recruitment businesses in there, for example, excuse me, then we know those guys, we're familiar with them, so it's all good. But then drop down a layer and see who's operating underneath that and just have visibility. Again, it's back to that control point. If you understand who's operating in your environment, then you relax because you know people are there. You can do checks on them. You can do audits. Excuse me, and it's compliant, which is fine. But I think if you've no visibility, then that's where you can get some risk associated.
Yeah, and given the need to spread the net as far as possible and make sure you've got the access to as many people as you can, is there a drive towards international recruitment capability and people wanted to know how to go about that?
Yeah, it's happening. It's happening now. It's been happening for a few years, and I think it'll keep accelerating in that, certainly in that tech space. A bit more difficult in places like hospitality and other, medical sectors. But Christina, you coming in there, are you seeing the same thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are companies that are really, really well established, and even contingent ones, right? I have seen, for example, supply teaching agencies where they are specifically set up to bring in teachers and talent from other countries just to fill the needs in the UK. The same for the NHS. There are ones that are specifically set up and they know how to bring people in just for that need. It's that desperate that they are looking internationally.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that as well, you've also got to think the other side of the fence, which is if the contractors are starting to move abroad and want to work, some of them trying to chase down better income tax rates in Eastern Europe, as opposed, which has been forced from IR35, then businesses are having to think about, well, how can we get our arms around that and have a good model that deals with that internationally, because our talent's left the UK and started to disappear and move around post IR35.
Okay. So we've talked about the mechanics then we need to put in place to manage the different demands of contingent recruitment. But given that availability is still critical, we've talked about that. What do we need to do to gain an edge in attracting and retaining the best available talent? So a contingent value proposition, what is that, Dan?
Sorry, couldn't find the mute button there. Well, everyone knows of an employee value proposition, don't they? So a lot of businesses and HR and TA teams are well used to that as a concept to hire people in to work for the organisation. But there shouldn't be no reason why you can't look at doing the same from a contractor perspective. So CVP is now being something that's been spoken about more frequently. I think there's been a bit of a fear factor introduced into the handling of contractors over the years, again, largely because of IR35 in the UK, where people have been told to keep these guys at arm's length. We don't want them becoming part and parcel of the business. And I agree with that from a tax perspective, but doesn't mean you need to treat them like pariahs and not have a similar sort of approach to thinking about ways that you can attract these freelancers to come and work in your business. So areas where you can look at developing contractor value propositions, often around the payroll piece and the different ways that people can operate, whether that's different ways that people can be paid. Payroll frequency is important. So do you necessarily have to let people wait a certain period of time to be paid? It's standard for people working through limited companies to wait a while to be paid. It doesn't always have to be the case. If you look at building the model out, you could pay them quicker. In lower paid sectors, I'm seeing an increase in people using like on-demand pay type technology. So actually to allow people to have salary advances and be paid quicker so they can get to work, which I think is really important. And again, could feed back into that D&I type proposition if people are allowing contractors to be able to access work and be paid on a more flexible basis rather than having to wait on a weekly or a quarterly or a monthly cycle or whatever it might be. I think that's important. I mean, for the higher paid guys, flexibility around pension planning is a big one. Certainly contractors that we manage, they like to put a lot of cash into pensions. So again, that's not often catered for very well if a hire is looking at engaging contractors on a standard payroll. It's often statutory, pension auto-enrollment type arrangements, which isn't particularly attractive. Whereas if you can facilitate payments into people's nominated SIP, then that's a big potential benefit, and that'll attract people to come and work. And as I said before, these guys are really well networked. So if you make it simple, if you make it attractive for them to come in, they'll be your biggest advocates for recommending your business for the next gig for their colleagues and their network that operate freelance.
And you've obviously seen examples of these out there. How would you describe the benefits to the hirers of these programs? What are the noticeable differences and improvements in performance of their contingent teams?
Just the longevity of the assignments, basically. Certainly in the areas that we can see where that package has been put together, there's a I won't say a reluctance for contractors to move on, but they get continually extended, and as Christine touched on earlier, these guys can be working in situ for quite some time because they're delivering great work and they're happy in the way that they're being managed, and they're still effectively operating on a flexible basis. They could leave if they wish, but they stay because they enjoy the work that's being delivered. They enjoy the way that they're being paid. For many contractors, the key things are, am I getting paid on time, and am I getting paid what I expect to be paid? And that sounds like two very simple concepts, but in this sort of myriad of different supply chain arrangements and software tech stacks, it can get lost sometimes, and there can be delays. So making sure the onboarding's super slick, and then making sure that the payroll is consistent is probably the two areas where they can have most value.
But you can also measure it, right? There's Net Promoter Score, and you can check with your hiring managers, how well are people performing, overall, are they happy with the service that they've been getting? But equally on the workers themselves, are they enjoying their assignment, that kind of thing. Reputation spreads, and it will affect not just your employer brand or your, contingent employer, your employer as I think the word I'm trying to say is your employer brand, but as an employer of contingent workers, which is probably a little confusing because contingent workers aren't really employed. Anyway, engaged. I would say engaged.
Engaged, yeah.
Engaged.
We know what you mean.
Anyway, so it can affect that, but also can affect your consumer brand, right? So if they have a bad experience, it may even impact on, whether people buy from you, on the consumer level as well.
Yeah, just on last one on that, Glassdoor is obviously a popular one for permanent people to leave comments. You should, if you're in TA or HR, you should do a bit of a Google and a mess around looking at where contractors are saying, making comments. There are quite a few platforms openly share feedback on gigs that they've received and assignments and how things are operating, and various forums out there. So always makes for interesting reading.
Very true.
Okay, right. So we've mentioned risk a few times today in relation to supply chains and compliance. There's perhaps more to consider in contingent recruitment because there are potentially more parties involved and different elements to deal with. Dan, what do we need to know about current consultations, particularly around umbrella companies?
Yeah, so I'll try and whip through this quite quickly because I'm conscious of time and we want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A.
Yeah.
So currently there's a proposed consultation out on the umbrella market and how umbrella payroll suppliers are used and engaged. There's been a lot of noise in the market about non-compliant payroll providers, of which there's been numerous examples. It's an unregulated market. I think many from within the industry would love it to become regulated. That'd certainly be my view. It would certainly help. And so there's a consultation where the government's proposing a few different approaches to how they might be able to drive compliance up in this sector. So the first one is looking at mandating to a recruitment business or a hirer who's engaged in a payroll company that they do some due diligence. Now, Christine will know from the work that she does that most good hirers do this anyway, and do spot checks on suppliers to make sure that they're operating correctly, they're deducting the right levels of tax, they've got the necessary contract paperwork, etc. But it doesn't happen across the market. So that's one thought that the consultation is looking at. I think it's the least likely to happen, if I'm honest, because it's probably not going to have a huge impact on the market. If it's a hirer wanting to operate using providers that might not be necessarily compliant, then I don't see that as sort of driving behavioural change. The second one is to look at where there is a non-compliant provider operating and the right levels of tax aren't being paid, is to actually push that tax risk up the supply chain to the hirer ultimately. I think that is potentially the most likely to happen. We've seen it happen with IR35. We've seen it with other changes that HMRC have made, where when they put debt transfer through the supply chain and move that up to a hirer, that really does drive behaviour. Hirers then have a vested interest in looking at, okay, we need to understand this, and are we comfortable with these suppliers? We saw a lot of hirers not wanting to operate contractors through PSEs post IR35. I suspect this might be a chance of that being the case if we go down option 2 with umbrellas, but the savvy hirers will actually look at wanting to understand better the umbrella companies operating and make sure the right type of provider for their organisation. And then the third proposal is to consider where a recruitment business is involved in that supply chain, actually passing the tax risk to the recruitment business and making the recruiter responsible for the deduction of tax. Again, could happen. Be interesting to see the consultation response on this when it closes, which I think is November, when we're looking at feedback. Don't think agencies want that to happen. I think they're comfortable to have payroll businesses operating underneath that can operate a lot of the benefits that we've been talking about today, like pensions, for example. If they are forced to operate PAYE, which in effect would be the outcome, doesn't make it very interesting for contractors. And so, yeah, there's some resistance, I know for sure, in the agency market to that proposal 3. But again, HMRC aren't thinking that all the way through. Potentially, they're wanting to understand, how do we make sure that we knock out these non-compliant providers? And I think all the consultation responses I've seen are really trying to encourage them to think through what the impact on the market is and the supply chain by going down one of those roads. So it closes at the end of this month. We should hope to hear more in November. Speculation really as to when it might, once they've made a decision what they want to do, when that might come into force. I wouldn't rule out April next year as a potential point for that. There's enough time for a change to go through the finance bill, but we just need to sit and wait and see. But I think it's important to put it on the radar to hirers that this is going on and just keep an eye on it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, again, it just goes to show the role of audit that is necessary. I think even in IR35 times when people were doing this as a project, they were, it went to an umbrella company. I don't have to worry about it. Yes, you do. You still do. You still have to make sure that, you are spending time auditing and checking that tax is being applied all the way down the supply chain from the IR35 work. But I think on the umbrella consultation, I think the chain liability is exceptionally likely, and it will just be very similar to the IR35 regime. That's my gut, and I agree with you on the April implementation. But if you are not making your audit teams aware of this, you could run into capacity issues when that does eventually come in.
Yeah, it just goes back to that control point we were talking about before, Christine. If hirers have got visibility of what's going on in the supply chain and there's control, then I'm not saying everyone should be relaxed about it, but we'd be calm that we understand what we can see, what's operating here, and we can manage that accordingly. We can do the checks. The issues come when there's that lack of visibility, and that's when hirers will start to get nervous if there's that debt transfer, I think.
Tickets for the January webinar will be available very shortly. You can feel it coming. Again, conscious of the time, we really do want to get to a few questions, but I don't think we can finish without one last word on our old friend, adversary, and talking point IR35. Christine, are we past it now, or clearly not? Where are we?
Well, we're definitely not past IR35. It's not a one and done activity. It does require ongoing management, and you may be insisting that all your contingent workers, and those are people paid by time without deliverables in their contracts, that those people operate under a PAYE structure. But do you know about those statements of work? I think I would be really concerned about those. Many time and materials arrangements and statement of work population would be caught under the legislation. Yet they may have flown under the radar by those tasked with IR35 compliance. And don't, again, audit. Are they auditing enough to see what they're doing here? And does HR have the visibility of those workers? I do worry about that. So what I will say is that HMRC is continuing to investigate areas for potential non-compliance in IR35 and also on the umbrellas. You notice that they publish fairly regularly, which umbrellas are not behaving as well as they should be. So what I would say is make sure your house is in and stays in order with great record keeping and awareness across the business.
Yeah, just to back up Christine on that, I have seen an Excel spreadsheet, which is effectively the sort of CEST version of an SOW test. So HMRC have got an actual Excel spreadsheet now where they are looking at stress testing SOW arrangements with businesses to try and understand if there are contractors hiding within those statements of work that are actually inside IR35. So just watch this space on that. I think there's more to come. We definitely got the sense that there's probably a lot of workers post IR35 that were pushed into SOW, and HMRC are aware of that.
They certainly are.
Okay, well, thank you both for some great insights, something we really need to embrace, and the differences that we need to know about. Thank you for those. We have a number of questions, and let me get into those now. So the first one does actually refer back to IR35. Says, we've been told by legal that we need to be careful offering benefits to contractors due to IR35. Isn't that a risk?
Yeah, so I can start on that. I think it's just touched on it in the session. Offering benefits per se doesn't mean that it doesn't affect how you engage in somebody, whether they're on an inside or an outside basis. I think that the key there on the benefit offering, if you want to get comfortable with it, is actually looking at engaging suppliers in your program that can offer some of those benefits, as opposed to you necessarily directly contracting with that person. And if you're doing that, you're probably going to be getting closer to employment. Whereas if they're managed by another supplier, stress test that supplier, ask them, what are the cool things that you do to look after these guys? Is it just the basics of paying someone on time and paying them the right amount, or are there other available benefits and options to those people that might attract them in? So I genuinely feel that, like I say, there's a big win for hirers in investigating into that contractor value proposition without them having to necessarily feel they're going to trip themselves up on IR35. You can absolutely do both.
Yeah, see, I think for those who are outside IR35, those are the people who are truly self-employed. They're in business for themselves. That's correct. I think you should not be offering benefits to those people because they're in business for themselves, and they should make those decisions about what benefits to offer as a business.
Yeah.
But those inside IR35, you can, depending on how your program is set up. I think the risks of the co-employment, on that particular point outweigh the contractor value proposition. And again, it could be a key way to bring talent in.
Okay, and the next question then is really about cost saving areas, and what are the main cost saving areas to look for in our contractor spends?
Oh, I have a list as long as my arm on savings opportunities that you can look at. So obviously demand management is going to be your biggest savings lever here. Are we using people to the right way that we can, and for as long as we need them, and that sort of thing. But once you've gotten beyond all the markup negotiations and you've done that, and you've really optimized your program from a contract perspective, you can look at it from some of the process things. So even things like time to hire, as an example, if you can bring people in quicker, that's a productivity gain, and you can actually measure that and then quantify it. I wrote a blog on it a few months ago, but I actually have like a library of 25 different savings levers that I look at, everything from volume discounts, even now, particularly in the high interest rate environment, cash flow is a significant, and payment terms is a significant lever that you can deploy now. And say, wait a second, hang on, how can we work better with you as a business, and what's in it for me if we pay you actually quicker? So there's a lot of opportunities, but if you need more help on, my 25 savings levers, do get in touch and we can, have a chat.
So is it potentially cheaper then and I said cheap, the overall cost, is it less potentially to hire a contingent worker than an equivalent permanent worker? Could that be the case?
Well, there's that EU legislation and that, has came over with the agency worker regulations that basically said that the minimum pay for a contingent worker should be the minimum equivalent of a permanent worker. So that has been pretty much, established. I don't want to get into Swedish derogation type stuff,
Okay.
but certain markets, you are going to pay more simply because of the demand supply issues. I see in IT, social workers, all sorts of stuff, but that really does point back to why is your permanent value proposition different than your contingent, and what can you do? Are you incentivizing the right thing or the wrong thing?
I think people get too focused on just solely the pay rate piece of that, and
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
there's loads of ancillary costs around it for businesses in how you engage. Just the amount of invoicing that goes on often that you see going into finance on systems, and the amount of time that finance teams need to sort of reconcile that, or even potentially duplicate pay timesheets that are coming through if there's no process around it. So you just need to have a whole holistic approach around it, as opposed to just focusing necessarily on the day rate, because the costs are way higher around the whole piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. An interesting question now about scale and numbers, I guess. How many contractors do you need to have before an MSP is suitable?
Right. Go on, Christine, you go.
Oh, used to be around 20 million. So whether that's $20 million, 20 million euros, or 20 million pounds, 20 million was the magic number from a spend perspective. So I didn't say it on the number of contractors. What I have seen, however, is that smaller ones, that, smaller programs, even down to the 10 million pound spend, or euros or dollars, that mark, you can get smaller programs that actually do work fairly well. There's always the option of doing it yourselves. I've seen companies, do what I would class as an internal managed service, where they take control and they set up their own resourcing desk inside their company to manage as a managed service would. So, in that case, then you need to weigh the cost and benefits of doing that, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I think there's definitely need to be mindful that the MSP model means different things to different people. It can operate, at least typically used for larger spends, but we regularly see businesses looking at bringing in that schema for anything from 10 contractors up. I'd say anything sub 10 contractors, no, but anything 10 up, there's definite value that can be had. Not least in just making sure you've got a nice streamlined process for onboarding those people, and there's that control element around it. It doesn't matter whether you've got 10 or 1,000 workers. That's an important piece. You don't want people in your business operating that haven't accepted the necessary paperwork, and often that contractor piece does look a little bit more Wild West than the permanent onboarding approach. The way that a lot of software suppliers are now piling into that mid-tier of the market now is also interesting. There's a lot of platforms coming into that space to operate in the areas that are probably too small for a classic MSP to operate in, but actually there's still spends of anything from sort of 5 million plus per annum, where they can add some value and give businesses access to have that sort of functionality by just operating online platforms.
Okay, and one last one then, because I think you just touched on it, Dan. There are a lot of options out there. So the question actually is, how do you decide between the multiple options in supply, for example, platforms, neutral vendors, MSPs, and so on? Well, how do you go about that?
That's a big question with 2 minutes left, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
I have an easy answer. Well, you could engage a procurement consultancy like Proxy.
Yeah, well done. I would say so. My first
in guiding companies through that decision tree, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. I'd just say take a step back and try and first figure out, what are you trying to achieve? So are you trying to achieve cost reduction? Are you trying to achieve risk? Are you trying to improve the candidate experience? And if you've got clarity on what you're trying to deal with, is it talent attraction that you're trying to address? Is that the challenge? That'll allow you to think a little bit more about the offerings, because a lot of the offerings tick lots of boxes, but some will be stronger in other areas. But I'm sure Christine would be happy to hold people's hand and walk them through the process.
Christine, a very last one. I'm just going to slip this in because somebody's just asked, and I think you can answer this straight away. Is there an audit checklist that you would recommend or you can share in terms of managing all of this process?
Yeah, there should be an audit checklist. You know, if someone wants to get in touch with me, I'm sure my contact details will be sent out.
Okay,
After,
so
that'd
the
be
person who just asked that, then one of the things we're going to do here is post a copy of recording of this event today, so you can refer back to it. But also we'll have Christine and Dan's contact details. So if there are things that you've been prompted to think about, you want to talk a bit more about, you'll have access to them, and you'll get those. If we've got your details, then you'll get access to that, and perhaps you can pick that audit checklist up that way. Any other specific questions? I'm sorry, I've missed a few. I haven't been able to get around to them. Again, if we haven't answered them more generally today, then please do get in touch with the two guys. I'm sure they'll be happy to have that discussion. Thank you to you both. I think that was a great session. I think you've covered it as well as we might have done in just about an hour. Thank you, and have a great day, everybody. From Christine, from Dan, and from myself, thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.